Thanks, Alan. Welcome, everyone. I'm Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director here, and I'm so pleased to be moderating the first session of today's Hybrid Cloud Management and Security Summit, brought to you by the great folks at Metallic, a Commvault venture, Okta, and Red Hat. The editorial staff here at redmondmag.com, awsinsider.net, and Virtualization and Cloud Review have worked really hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic today, so we really hope that you enjoy it. Real quick before we start, we have 3 great sessions today, but before that, I wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. So keep an eye on your inbox. You'll get an email from us in a couple of days when the replay is available. Second, each of today's 3 sessions will include a 5 to 10 minute Q&A at the end. So please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as soon as they come up, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Third, during today's final session, we are giving away an Xbox Series X console, but you have to be present to win, so please be sure to stay on for the entire event for that. And finally, we have resources for you from our sponsors, Metallic, Okta, and Red Hat. They're right on your console right there. So please do download those and check them out. It's because of Metallic, Okta, and Red Hat underwriting this content that we can bring you to Summit. So we thank them for sponsoring today's event, supporting the community, and we ask that you check out those resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now on to the first session of today's Summit. This one's called Modern Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Management, and it features a frequent speaker here, Joey D'Antoni. He's a principal consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. Besides being a longtime columnist at redmondmag.com, he's also a VMware vExpert and a Microsoft Data Platform MVP with over 20 years of experience working in both Fortune 500 and smaller firms. Joey has worked extensively on database platforms and cloud technologies and has specific expertise in performance tuning, infrastructure, and disaster recovery. So you guys are in for a great one. Joey, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you, Gladys. And hey, everybody, welcome to Hybrid Cloud, Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Management. One cool story I like to tell that I just kind of thought about while I was getting ready for this presentation is hybrid cloud has kind of been a thing as long as there's been cloud. So one of the first presentations I did at a major database conference was a SQL Server conference in 2013, I think. And Azure VMs are relatively new, and I built an environment that spanned both my laptop and a VPN to the cloud. So these technologies are nothing new, but the way we manage them and the approaches we take are maturing a lot. And part of that's because I think some of the cloud vendors have gotten smarter and better about the way they handle these things. The first part of this that I like to talk about is defining what a hybrid cloud is. And the answer to that question is there really isn't a singular good definition. Is hybrid cloud multi-cloud? Is it hybrid cloud if you have an on-prem data center but you use Office 365 for email? I would say yes, because there's a lot of cloud resources you have to have that in place. The truth is now, like in 2023, almost all organizations, even ones that think they're 100% on-prem, are probably using some form or fashion of a hybrid cloud where they have data that's other places, whether it be using, a software as a service CRM like Salesforce or Dynamics, or using Office 365 or Google Suite for their email. That suddenly means you have data that's, in different places, and you really have to think about what that means. You have to think. And there are a lot of different things and concerns to think about. We're talking about kind of both security and management today. And just knowing where that data lives, how it's protected. For example, if you went from having your own email servers to using something like Office 365, how is that data protected? What's the legal situation on it? Like if you had to put a legal hold on email, those are all things you have to be concerned with. Likewise, there's like another approach in terms of how organizations use hybrid cloud, and that's to use it for either burst capacity or disaster recovery. Or some organizations will also put the majority of their workload in the cloud, but have the ability to push stuff back on-prem. And the reason for this, and we'll talk through this later, is, you might have some workloads that are really persistent and better suited to running on maybe physical hardware or, very large VMs that might not be as cost effective to run in the public cloud. There's a very famous Twitter person who helped write Ruby, who's got a company now, who's famously saying, we're moving all our stuff out of the cloud and back to on-prem, and we're saving all this money. And that is probably the right decision for his very internet-facing, very large engineering-focused organization. But not all organizations are going to do that. But where I see this happening, and the other place I see it happening too, is where acquisitions happen, and organizations end up with a data presence through acquisition, and you run into those sorts of things. Finally, on the left, we have the term private cloud here, and private cloud also has some interesting definitions. And to keep dating myself further, when I was at Comcast in, I think, 2011, 2012 timeframe, we actually built a private cloud there, and it's one of the projects I'm probably most proud of in my career. We spec'd the hardware. We wrote a lot of code to automate the deployment of VMs through a web portal that our customers could use. And it was also probably the world's most expensive cloud because we used really expensive hardware and we used VMware and everything, and nothing was free. But that was at the time, our notion of what a private cloud is. What private cloud has somewhat evolved into, I think, and there's still some large organizations. I know I'm speculating a little bit on this organization, but I know the entire private cloud team at Comcast got hired by Walmart. And I've heard some cool things about Walmart's data stories, so I imagine they have something like that as a framework. But more commonly, what private cloud has come to mean is solutions like Azure Stack from Microsoft or AWS Outpost. And these are solutions that try their best to emulate the functionality you have in the cloud in some kind of standardized hardware that you have on premises. These solutions, in my opinion, they're pricey for what they do. And the functionality will never match the cloud because they're always going to be kind of behind what's going on in the public cloud. But just know that they are an option in some organizations that can say they can never go to the cloud for various regulatory reasons. May be interested in those solutions as well. Like I said, vast reality. Everybody's going to be in some sort of hybrid cloud because you're going to have some stuff someplace, some stuff another place. So just to kind of talk about these scenarios, are you using software as a service offerings, but otherwise on premise? So if you're using Office 365, let me tell you what that kind of means for you. You suddenly have an Azure tenant that you might not know about when you have Office 365, because all authentication to Office 365 takes place through Azure Active Directory. So suddenly you have to sync all of your identities from your on-premises Active Directory into Azure Active Directory just to be able to migrate into Office 365. That's kind of a really good example of how just using a software as a service offering suddenly becomes hybrid cloud. But other kind of weirdness there is if you want single sign-on to say Salesforce or DocuSign or name a software as a service app, those things can all do single sign-on with Azure AD. They can't really do single sign-on with your AD, or if they can, it's much harder. So these are a lot of ways that organizations kind of find themselves, even if they think they're on-prem, by adding a software as a service provider. They're suddenly in the cloud. Another example of how organizations use the public cloud, and in my opinion, this is one of the better ways to get started with the cloud, is using the cloud with a disaster recovery site. I always remember asking customers, pre-cloud being big, and when speaking, because I've done a lot of talks on disaster recovery because I grew up in New Orleans and in North Carolina, so I'm pretty familiar with the concept of disasters. But one of the things I always ask is, how many data centers do you have? Is it 2, 3? And frequently, most customers would say we have one data center and we kind of do what we do. Well, there are 54 Azure regions, I think, last time I counted, and they have multiple data centers in them. So potentially now you have hundreds of data centers that you can use. And there are tools Zerto has an excellent tool, and so does Azure Site Recovery, that allow you to just ship your VMs to a cloud, and you can take advantage of using that cloud as a DR site for minimal cost. Like you're only paying for the storage aspect of that, not necessarily for the compute. So that's a really powerful way to do it. Another thing, I mentioned this earlier, was Stack and Outpost, but did you buy an appliance from a cloud vendor to run on-premises? There was just an article on Redmond about a week ago about how Google is trying to upend this market a little bit. That was like 2 days before they killed Google domains, giving people even less confidence in Google Cloud. But I digress about my Google talking. But Google has an appliance in that space too. And then finally, do you have applications that run across the cloud and on premises? We run into this with some of our organizations. I can just give you a real basic example. There's an Azure service called App Proxy that allows you to use Azure AD logins to apps that may be running on premises. In our case, we have Azure App Proxy set up for our VMware vCenter that's in our data center. So if I want to log into vCenter and I can't get to a VPN, I can go through App Proxy and get there. And that's kind of a real basic example of like how we have something working together. But like we've seen customers where maybe they'll have a database that's on-prem because it needs to be on a really big server. It needs to have super good performance, and yet things that are pulling data from it are in the cloud. And that can have some costing implications that we're going to talk about here in a few slides, because that is kind of important. So the first thing we always like to talk about with hybrid cloud is connectivity and latency. We'll talk about money later, but in order to get started, we have to have a network. And so for things like software as a service offerings, that's less of a concern, because if you're connecting to something like Office 365 or Google Suite, you're doing that over just internet endpoints. So in most cases, in nearly all cases, I know on the Microsoft side anyway, Microsoft advises against using any sort of a dedicated connection for that, because there's actually more availability if you're using their internet endpoints. So for software as a service, those solutions are typically designed with the assumption that you're connecting through the internet. So that is a kind of a common assumption. Where this gets harder is when you start talking about actual cloud infra. I hate to slight my SaaS people like that, but like virtualized infrastructure in a cloud, you do need a network connection then. And depending on the nature of what you're doing, that connection may need to be pretty low latency. For example, I mentioned that talk I gave in 2013 earlier. I had what was called is called a point-to-site VPN running on my VM on my laptop, connected to a gateway in an Azure data center. And the latency was about like 30 or 40 milliseconds. It was not great, and I'm sure the bandwidth was terrible, but it connected me. I could do my demo. Obviously, for like any kind of a real hybrid environment, you're going to need to have a lower latency connection than that, and you're going to want it to be predictable. The kind of concepts around each of the cloud providers are the same. Effectively, you can create a gateway on the cloud side that gives you a public IP that lets you have a VPN connection. And then you kind of have two choices. You can have what we typically call, Azure calls a site-to-site VPN. I'm not sure what AWS and Google call that. But that site-to-site VPN is just a network appliance that runs in your data center and gives you have a dedicated, I say dedicated, but it's a VPN persistent connection between your data center and the cloud. That's what we have at DCAC. Those are somewhat limited on the amount of bandwidth and the latency, because that connection, even though it's encrypted and through a VPN, is going over the public internet. The kind of premium option, and AWS calls this Direct Connect and Azure calls it Express Route, allows you to have a dedicated line. And I know in the case of AWS, in the case of Azure, that goes all the way up from, I think you can get like a 50 meg connection all the way up to 100 gigabytes. So depending on the need and how much you have in your data center and how much traffic's going back and forth, you can do that. So the next point on this slide is talking about monitoring across diverse platforms. And to me, this is one of the bigger management challenges, because what starts to happen as your organization evolves in their cloud usage from just using VMs and storage and networks and stuff like that to using more services that are platform as a service. And even if you think you're going to move into the cloud and just keep running what you're running, it almost never happens that way. Like always, organizations will start to adopt things like database as a service, web app as a service, even just using cloud storage like S3 really changes the paradigm of how you use storage, and that stuff is really different. It's not like just simply monitoring things in a VM. So whatever tools you're using to monitor your environment now, you may have to either augment those by using some cloud native tools, consider adopting the cloud tools to use on-prem. So like Microsoft has a product called Azure Arc that allows you to kind of integrate stuff that's on-prem, whether it be Windows Server or Kubernetes or a SQL Server, into the Azure control plane. So like from the Azure portal, it looks like you're managing an Azure server, but it's actually on-prem. So that's something to keep in mind. So monitoring, key concern here. Ensuring that on-premises solutions are kept compatible with cloud solutions. This is something that, like I mentioned, you're probably going to, as you move into the cloud, adopt some platform as a service offerings. The way updates are typically handled on most platform as a service offerings is that they're out of your control. It's one of the benefits the cloud provider gives you to take advantage of those solutions. So just ensuring that like your code's up to date. You know, if you're on databases that they're the same version and you can go back and forth, it's something you really need to pay a little bit more attention to than where you manage all the updates. Additional costs for data egress. I was just writing some stuff for a couple of white papers for a cloud vendor on this topic, so it's very, very front of mind. Data into all of the clouds is free. Data out of all of the clouds cost money on a per gigabyte basis. And you may not think, like, it's not necessarily a lot until you start to get to some really high traffic numbers. Like the Azure cost for outbound traffic is 8.7 cents a gigabyte. And you're like, oh, that's not bad, because even if you have a terabyte, that's like $100. Or my math might be wrong. Anyway, ignore my math. And you get the first 100 gig free, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you have applications that are poorly designed, for example, if you have a database that's running in the cloud and you have users that are running Excel and downloading large tables out of the database repeatedly every day, that can start to add up. And that's a really basic example of like a poor pattern, but numerous patterns like that can take place. And you need to evaluate that because it's going to lead to further discussion. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. We always have the ever-present question of security, but what happens when you get into a hybrid cloud environment is that you have a new security paradigm that you may not be experienced with. And this is something that I help customers with, and they sometimes struggle because it's like adopting a whole new platform, right? It's not just like, especially, you know, you're on VMware, Hyper-V on-prem, you have this like whole new set of tools and control planes and things like that. So figuring out how to secure that, how to maintain compliance, how to meet audit concerns, those are all real things. How to avoid, I just saw like, it almost feels like a joke whenever I do one of these presentations, but I can usually, within 2 weeks of a presentation, if I search for S3 data breach, which is Amazon storage solution, I can find one that happened in the last 2 weeks. And I don't remember who it was, but it was somebody big enough that I heard it on the regular news, not tech news. And Amazon goes out of their way to prevent you from enabling public access on S3, but people still do for various reasons. And breaches can happen. So it's just a lot more surface area when you're in the cloud, and it's something more to think about from a security perspective. So one of the things about hybrid clouds is you're typically, if you're talking about having a hybrid cloud, it means you're in the process of maintaining or migrating systems. It is very, very important before you migrate to understand what your performance profile is going to look like. And typically, I do a lot of work with performance tuning. This is an area where I really don't get that deep into the weeds. I mainly like to look at 2 or 3 key metrics from any kind of workload that's going into the cloud, and this is what I want to understand. So, free consulting advice here. I look at CPU utilization. So that's an important one. You want to know how many CPUs you need to spec in whatever solution you're buying. Memory utilization is trickier. I'm a database professional. Database servers always use all of their memory, so there are other kind of advanced database metrics I tend to look at before that. But I tend to say the server's running on-prem and it has, say 64 gig of memory, and it's running well, let's keep it at 64 gig of memory. The third number, and this one's probably the one that's the most complex to monitor for, and you have to look at it over time, is storage throughput. I obviously care about storage volume. You need to know how much disk you need to buy. But the challenging thing is understanding how much disk utilization you have. Because this is really the major, in our experience working with cloud customers for 10 plus years now, storage throughput is probably the biggest limitation in the cloud, and it's a lot better now. Like it was in the 2012 days, it was really, really awful. Now you can get pretty close to the all-flash stuff you can get on-prem. Like I can get low single-digit storage latencies, but you need to know what that spec's going to be. So you need to know the term we like to use, and is commonly used in the industry, is IOPS, and that's I/O operations per second. So you want to track how many IOPS your server is doing, and in Linux you can do that using a tool called IOstat. In Windows, there are some various perfmon counters like disk transfers per second that will show you how many read and write IOPS the operating system is doing. And once you have that in place, you can spec out your disk, and then you should be able to get a comparable sizing. And while this mainly talks about VMs, if you're using things like database as a service offerings, those also come with I/O specifications, and you may have to dig to find them, but they're published. And having that understanding can give you really good predictability of your performance. And we like predictability. But even once you've done that, it's important to test your busy workloads before you even think of migrating them. I have a story on Redmond. It's like 5 years ago, but they're still a current client. It's probably 6 years ago now. They're still a current client, and it was like the tale of 2 teams. 2 teams, same client. One of them decided to kind of adopt a new storage paradigm when they were migrating into the cloud. I should have shut that down. It was my fault for not yelling loud enough. And they used a different kind of VM that I didn't recommend. And as soon as they migrate, and finally, most importantly, their testing consisted of like a developer running a few queries and not doing a full load test. As soon as we got into the cloud, the performance was awful. Like we were immediately hair on fire. The next day, I told them to not do the storage thing they were doing and use the VM I told them to, and everything went fine. So testing would have mitigated that. The other team, who tested extensively, when they migrated into the cloud, I was nervous because my phone never rang or email never showed up or anything. Like it just worked. So testing, get representative loads. One of the things we were working with a client this week was they had a big sales event that they were really concerned about the workload for. And one of the things they were talking to us about was, should we resize this? Because it's going to cost a lot to resize this. And all we could ask them was, do you have a way to test this workload so we can see what it's going to look like once you're doing it? And they really didn't. They're like, we can't do a full load test. And if you can't do that, you're kind of grasping at straws. So like our recommendation was to size up. And if you pay money, and the worst case is nobody writes a press release about you about how your software failed. So, and then you can use that load to further assess. So, like, I know testing in production is bad, but sometimes that may be the only way to do it if you don't have the right tools to simulate a full load. This is even more important if you want to move to a platform as a service offering. Sneak peek of my Redmond column that's probably going to get published next week. Database as a service platforms aren't necessarily for all workloads. A lot of those solutions, those platform as a service solutions, are kind of aimed at median average workloads. If your workload's an outlier and you're really pushing the envelope of what a system can do, some of those platform as a service offerings may not be a good fit for your solution. So that's something to keep in mind, and you want to be able to test that. So when you're talking about managing a hybrid cloud, and this kind of takes a step back a little bit from when you're kind of in the weeds talking about performance stuff, and this is more kind of holistic things you're probably going to be discussing with your boss. You need to rationalize and really come up with a strategy for which workloads are going into the public cloud. Are you looking for things that are, maybe exclusively customer facing to go into the public cloud? Are you looking at workloads that might need to have some kind of rapid scaling to go into the cloud? These are places that are kind of beneficial. Like I always like to say, when you pay for a cloud solution, you're paying for flexibility because the cloud is way more flexible than your on-prem solution, unless you're like one of 3 companies that have all sorts of awesome automation. But you want to have a strategy around hybrid cloud. You want to determine what workloads are going to remain on-prem. Typically, those workloads that are going to remain on-prem are things that would be very expensive to run in the cloud. So, for example, if you run SAP to manage your ERP solution, SAP is very, very hardware intensive, and you need to have a lot of servers and lots of storage and memory and all that stuff. And it has to be on all the time. So that's something that can be really expensive to run in the cloud. I've worked with some customers in like the gambling industry or the financial services industry. Those companies, they need that last like 2% of performance. Like I was talking about how performance is pretty close in the cloud now. Those companies need that last 2%. They even need that extra percent of not virtualizing, right? A lot of those companies that'll run, if you're running stuff on physical gear, you're probably not going to want to run into the cloud. Here's where it gets confusing. It can be tempting to maybe move some cheaper application components to the cloud and leave expensive options like that big database server on premises. However, remember you have that concept of data egress. And in the case of the database server being on-prem, you would have data ingress. So I guess that's not quite as bad, but it can be more costly. So the thing you always have to be thinking about with cloud architecture is network egress, because that can add up. And it's something that's, I don't want to say it's unpredictable because you can monitor for it and monitor what it's costing you, but it is, to use an economics term, it is what we call an unbounded cost. There is no maximum that you can spend on network egress, so you want to pay attention to that. Typically, the approach we like to take with customers is that you move application stacks in their entirety to the cloud, and if you want to move them back on-prem, you move the application stack back entirely on-prem. There are some exceptions, like that authentication thing I talked about with vCenter, but in general, especially for customer-facing apps, they should either be in the cloud or on-prem. But just because of the network and fragility, or in some cases you may have them in both places for DR purposes, but like you really want to avoid having a dependency be on that cloud network. And then finally, build a roadmap to determine which applications should reside where and which external dependencies should exist. Because one of the things I think that's kind of critical, and this is something you kind of have to keep going back to as you run over time. Some companies will repatriate some systems, for either cost reasons or maybe performance reasons or who knows, and that's fine. You just want to be strategic about the way you plan things, where you put those cloud resources. Governance, everybody's least favorite, not exciting topic that I always end up talking about when we're talking about these security topics. One of the things the clouds have all done a pretty good job of is giving you tools like policy and tags and things like this to better govern your environment. Policy, if you've ever worked with Active Directory and you've used group policy, cloud policy is not that different from that. Like, say, a classic example of a cloud policy might be we can only deploy resources in U.S. East and U.S. West because, those are the data centers are regulatory, or maybe for our EU folks, we can only deploy in country. So like our France division can only deploy to the France regions in Google and Azure. Those are the ways you can do policy. There's a lot of compliance stuff that's built into policy. So if you have audit requirements, there are like policy frameworks that are templated for those particular audit things that you can apply. Tagging is something that I really like, and it's something that's implemented kind of in Kubernetes with the concept of labels, and it's also available in newer versions of VMware where you can tag resources. This really has two benefits. The first thing I always like to talk about is cost management. So I like having a policy that says all resources have to be tagged with their cost center, because that makes it really easy to figure out who's responsible for most of the cost in your cloud bill. And I'm probably burdened by my time at Comcast when I had to do all sorts of machinations to get this information, or try to use regex to extract who the owner was from the server name. That was really fun, let me tell you. Tags are just simply key value pairs. So like you would simply have a tag that said cost center marketing or cost center finance. The other really cool thing about tagging that kind of goes beyond governance and more into management is you can drive your automation around tagging. So I forget the specifics on AWS, but I know in Azure, each resource can have up to 15 tags. So you can have additional tags like environment, production, system, SAP, tier, database, that kind of thing. Those tags are also queryable through various automation solutions, which helps you can automate stuff based on those tags. So those are all kind of the reasons you should do this. It helps you manage cost and security. So one of the other ways you can use policy is to limit the types of resources that people can deploy. There's an Azure resource for Synapse Analytics, their data warehousing solution, that is like $300,000 a month. It's the highest tier. I think it's probably the most expensive thing in all of Azure. And one of the things you could create a policy would be, and Microsoft may or may not let you deploy that if you have a paid account. I don't know how much monitoring they do around credit, but you could just have a policy that would prevent anybody from accidentally deploying that kind of thing. Or you could just have an allow list of things you want deployed, which might be an easier way to write that. Like if you want to say you can deploy VMs, and you can add things to that later, but those things can help you kind of manage your cloud environment. And having this governance framework should apply both on-prem, and it will help you meet your compliance requirements. So build these standards and policies. So determine what types of resources that should be used. Like I mentioned, it's probably easier for you to build a list of things your organization is going to use than not use, because the cloud providers have so many services. Between the cloud providers and the external marketplaces, there are thousands of services that can be in place. I've seen this run two ways. I've seen organizations that just kind of let it be the Wild West, and their developers can build whatever they want to build. And invariably, those are the projects that go way over budget. I once worked on a project that I called the Tinder project, because all their development team did was swipe right. Like the cost on that project for like $30 million a month in cloud spend. But I don't love those things unless of course I was their partner of record. But using policy to allow resources is typically a good approach. You don't want to go crazy with it. You don't want to really hamstring your teams. You don't want cloud to be like you have to go through these 35 approval gates to get a resource you need. But it makes sense to help manage your cost, to determine what types of resources you can use. This also inherently kind of helps you understand your security profile better and limits you from doing not great things. If you know the 20 types of resources your team's going to use, you know how you can secure those things. Also want to determine security and cloud policies. A lot of the security policies are going to just be best practices around cloud security. This is something that I really think is a good idea. The tools the cloud providers give you for security are pretty good. They're not perfect, and a lot of times they're trying to sell you additional things, which I don't love. But the baseline recommendations they give you are pretty important. You also want to talk about allowed regions and locations, and this might also tie into your high availability strategy too. The vendors have this concept known of availability zones, where you have data that's spread across multiple data centers in a single region to provide you higher levels of availability. Also, maybe limit regions for legal reasons like we talked about. And then finally, you want to limit access to your cloud environment. So one of the things the way I like to describe access to the control plane of your cloud is like, how many people have access to your on-prem data center? Not that many more people should have access to your cloud environment than have access to your on-prem data center. Obviously, you're going to have more developer types that are going to have access to a cloud environment, but it is something to keep in mind. Security is job one. So when we talk about hybrid cloud, one of the things we talk about, and I think I've been on a couple of podcasts talking about this topic, is cloud repatriation. And, do organizations really, besides that guy on Twitter, really move back stuff from the cloud to on-prem? And we tend to see this happen, just to be completely honest with you, with more engineering, technical-focused companies, where engineering orgs will decide that they're spending too much to run something in the cloud, or it's not getting the performance they need. But I think even for companies that have less of a focus on engineering, if you're still maintaining an on-prem data center, it's a viable place to run workloads. So it is worth periodically looking at maybe your spend on your largest cloud applications and saying, hey, could we do this more cost effectively in the cloud? Could moving this on-prem, save us some money? Likewise, it can go the other way too. Cloud offerings and costs change over time. A big kind of evolving change that's happening in Azure right now is there's a new kind of storage for VMs, and it's about 20% cheaper and it's faster. It's not everywhere yet. It's not in all the regions in all the world. So that's why we haven't moved everybody to it. But it is something that is a nice a thing that can change a paradigm, because you talk about 20% lower storage costs, maybe that, and lower latency, that maybe changes your mindset. VM sizes change. I remember the client I told the story about who tested and also didn't test at the same time. When we first started looking at Azure for them, there weren't VMs that were big enough to run their workload, and now you can get a VM with 416 cores and 12 terabytes of memory. It costs as much as my house a month, I think, but you can get those things. Also, the requirements of your application change. You may have an application that kind of goes dormant, and you might not need the flexibility you once needed, so it might be cheaper to run that either on-prem or resize it into a smaller cloud solution. And then finally, I think establishing a formal review process can give some rigor to this effort, like having dedicated, quarterly meetings or semi-annual meetings to discuss this can be really helpful, and it really helps you kind of reassess your architecture. And one of the things around that is you want to have, business planning people in those meetings, because you want to understand, how is this application going to be used going forward? What's the expected load? So one of the things I always tell everybody, and I am biased because I do training, but train your staff. The cloud is hard and different. It is very different than an on-premises world. And it's more importantly, it's constantly changing, and your people need to be accustomed to that and know where to look to understand those changes, because it is not trivial the amount of change that happens like on a monthly basis between cloud services. So having good training and having good understanding around that is really helpful. But they should at least have a basic understanding of costing and how to price out solutions, resources, and security. Your costs can go really sideways in a hurry. And it's important to know the patterns. It's important to know where the costs lie. Like I talked about data egress, and that's kind of top of mind for me right now, so I was just writing about it. But it is something we really hear a lot about from some of our customers, because if maybe they're serving video out of an application and they're serving that to end customers, that suddenly can be a lot of money. So that's something to understand. They also need to understand what the security paradigm looks like and how that works in the cloud. Or hire people who do, and these can be consultants or full-time employees. But if you're going to move into the cloud, it is something you want to have the right people for. Understand challenges like backup and monitoring. Backup and monitoring in a hybrid cloud environment isn't something that's really hard. It's just different. Where do your logs and your backups live? So are you going to ship log files to a cloud solution? Do they live on-prem, in the cloud, or somewhere else? Do you still use like a tape library vendor like Iron Mountain, for example? I think one of the things about the cloud is that, and it's not a universal truism, but especially for something like backups, I can say storage is generally cheaper, especially with the tiering that's involved with storage, than you can do yourself on-prem. I also know that it scales infinitely. You'd never really have to worry about running out of space. That's somebody else's concern. So I think it's always a pretty good idea to keep long-term backups and things like logs in the cloud. There also tend to be better tools for analysis for those things. The cost is going to be very close to the best you could do, and like I say, generally speaking, I think it's going to be cheaper. And you have more robust tools for backup and monitoring. So these are something to talk to your vendors about. And it's going to depend on the nature of what you do, because some of the monitoring solutions will continue to work when you move into the cloud. A lot of the on-prem monitoring solutions are going to work fine, but as you move out of VMs and into more advanced kind of cloud services, your monitoring solutions may no longer work, and you may need to reevaluate your monitoring strategy for that solution. So don't try to do everything at once. I thought this was a cool picture of a waterfall, because remember waterfall development, where we wrote code for like 5 years and then we released a product, and then we wrote code for 5 years? We don't really do that anymore. We tend to iterate using Agile for better or for worse. Don't try to either repatriate all of your workloads, move giant applications all at once. You want to start small, get your footing, especially in a cloud environment, or a different environment, I should say, and don't just suddenly try to slam everything through. There are some cloud solutions that exist in the world that I feel like, and I'm not going to name names because I'm about to be a little bit derogatory, but I feel like some of those solutions are built for organizations where their CI/CTO said, we have to be in the cloud next month. I don't care what it takes, get it done. And those solutions are expensive. They're not very good. They're not very scalable. They don't really take advantage of anything in the cloud. It's just like to check a box to say we're in the cloud. And that's what tends to happen when organizations try to do everything at once, or they just use a mass migration tool and they don't do a lot of planning. You really want to gain some understanding around how you're doing things and why you're doing things before you really jump in with both feet to help get comfortable and do things the right way. Because you have a lot of options, and it's really easy to do things not the best way. One of the nice things about the cloud, for the most part, it's pretty easy to tear stuff down. I always like to joke about cloud networking that cloud networking is so much easier than on-prem because you never have to run cable, which is accurate. I can build and tear down networks all I want. There are a few things that we can do that really stick us, but generally they just cost money, and they can be resolved. Hybrid clouds are each unique and face unique challenges. And what I mean by this is there's no, and I kind of addressed this early in the presentation, there's no static definition of what a hybrid cloud is or what it looks like. And each organization kind of has their own approach, which its own mix of systems. So don't worry, you are somewhat alone in what you're doing, but at the same time, you're following a similar pattern to a lot of other people, but you're going to have some unique challenges around various systems, and understand that. Policy and consistency are really important for security and management. You want to implement things in a consistent manner. Like don't name your servers after cartoon characters. That might hit close to home for me right now because I'm working on one of those solutions right now. But like think logically, plan, implement things consistently. Monitoring and backups are something that can be challenging in a hybrid pattern, just in terms of where you do them and how you manage those backups and where you store them. Monitoring is going to get more difficult as you move into more advanced cloud services. So talk to your monitoring vendors, tell them what you want to do, see what products they have, see if those products can meet your needs. If you need to adopt other things, consider adopting other things. There is kind of baseline monitoring built into the cloud providers that they give you. But you have all those kind of solutions available to you. And then don't try to do everything all at once. It can be a lot to try to do everything all at once. Cloud migrations are hard. Moving systems, large systems, are also hard. You need to get your baseline infrastructure, like your networks and stuff, in place, and then understand your policy. And then you can start to do more advanced things. And it's just like anything else: crawl, walk, run. Right? Once you start being able to walk, it will be a lot easier to run. All right, Gladys, do we have any questions?
We do. We have a couple of questions, so I'm going to try to get as many of them to you before the end of this session. And we're going to start with a fun one from Rob, who asked, why not just name servers by cartoon characters like Disney?
Because I don't know if I'm on a production database server when my server is called Mini. and I don't know. It's much easier if my server is named, US Prod DB01 than Mickey or Minnie or Goofy or pick your favorite Disney character. I guess I could extend that into the Star Wars universe, but that's the main reason, because having some names that has some logical value or means let me rephrase that. They mean something more than the person. If you name your servers after cartoon characters, like 2 people probably know what those mean, and when you get a third person, that person's not going to know. Whereas if you kind of have some meaningful terms in your server names, people can understand them.
Right. And just as an aside, Disney is famously litigious, so if you do use their character names, if you use any of their IP for anything, don't let them know, please. All right, we have a question here from Michael. How should policy be applied for our cloud environment?
Oh, good question. So I kind of break down policy into 3 phases. The first is kind of like organizational compliance. So if I wanted a server naming standard that said you couldn't name servers after Disney characters, I can implement a policy to do that. And that's kind of a nice one. Like, we have a policy at DCAC that in order to create new resources, you have to say the date you created it and who created it in a tag. So that kind of that helps us keep our cloud clean and keep our bill down. There's also regulatory aspects to this. So maybe if you want to enforce that everything's encrypted at rest, you can enforce that via policy. Or you want to limit the regions where people can deploy stuff. And then finally, you can kind of use it to help reduce your bill. Like a classic example of that I like to share is I've done a lot of cloud training, and those students get to have labs. And in those labs, the policies are super, super locked down, right? Like it's like you want to deploy an A1 VM. Well, guess what? The only kind of VM you can deploy in that scenario is an A1. So you can take advantage of things like that to kind of control costs as well.
Great. From Pam, who's asking, I think, about cloud cost disaster stories. Pam asks, what are the cost mistakes that you've seen organizations make?
We need another session. Yeah, the big one I think is data egress can be a big one. Like if somebody designs something poorly, or one of the common scenarios is maybe the thing to remember is not all cloud resources are necessarily available in all cloud regions for each vendor. So maybe somebody built something in East 1, and then they wanted something, but it was only available in East 2. So they put like the storage in East 1, but the service was in East 2, and you have all this traffic that you're not accounting for. That's a really common one. I think just oversizing things, like that tender example I saw where like all those resources were idle except for when they were used, and then they were peaked, but they were idle like 95% of the time. So those are the kind of the main common ones. The one thing we didn't touch on at all today, but for those workloads that are running, are going to run for a long time and require a lot of resources, you should evaluate buying reservations for those, because that's the best way to reduce your cost.
Great point. From Anil, what kind of cloud backup storage is kept in dedicated storage clusters?
So that's kind of a complicated question, Anil. The backup solutions that the cloud providers all have immutability built into them, which is really important. In the age of ransomware, is a really important concept. Immutability simply means once a file's written, it can't be updated. That's built into both the backup solutions and the storage solutions they have. So like S3 and Azure Blob and Google's Object Store all have the option of making things immutable. In terms of the protection that's built into their clusters, they don't really, they talk a little bit about what they do, but I kind of looked at their data reliability numbers, and they promise like 11 nines of no data loss. So I don't want to say I have more faith in cloud provider storage than I do on-prem storage, but I have almost just as much. And I am burned by the fact that a SAN vendor once accidentally erased a production SAN while I was on call.
Oh, perfect. All right, and I'm going to end with this final question from Eleanor, who asked about the security challenges that you typically see in hybrid cloud environments. Can you give a couple of examples?
Yeah, I think the big one is, let's face it, typically organizations who are going into a hybrid cloud model just aren't necessarily as well versed in the cloud as dedicated solutions, and just kind of the common mistakes they make about not having the best understanding of what the security model looks like in the cloud in terms of the way like role-based access control works, or private versus public endpoints. And I think the big one is just avoiding those foibles and like understanding those security models. And AWS for me is particularly challenging with this. It's not easy to get your security between services right, and like you have to write JSON and stuff. But I think just spending the time to kind of have understanding about that framework and what that looks like.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, Joey, for answering those audience questions and for the great presentation.
Thanks, Gladys.
Everyone else, stay tuned. We will be right back at the top of the hour for the second session of the day, Modern Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Security. And this is a good one, folks. This features frequent speakers here, Dave Kawula and John O'Neill Sr. So stay tuned, and meanwhile, check out those resources in the console from Metallic, Okta, and Red Hat.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Modern Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Security, brought to you by our sponsors, Metallic, Okta, and Red Hat. Our speakers for this session are Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. Dave is a highly accomplished technology professional and Microsoft MVP specializing in Microsoft Azure, hybrid cloud solutions, and cybersecurity. With over 20 years of experience in the IT industry, Dave has established himself as a trusted advisor to organizations of all sizes, helping them navigate the complex world of Microsoft technologies and optimizing their IT infrastructure. As a sought-after speaker and presenter, Dave has delivered engaging sessions at numerous industry conferences, sharing his expertise and insights on topics ranging from cloud migrations and security to disaster recovery and infrastructure optimization. His ability to simplify complex concepts and provide practical guidance has earned him a reputation for delivering informative and actionable content. John O'Neill Sr., our other presenter, is a chief technologist with more than 25 years in IT, having worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects, and he has authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspiratory books and exec blueprints, and develops courseware for Pluralsight. Guys, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David. It is our distinguished pleasure to be back. It feels like we're getting back in the saddle on these again, John. I know we took a little bit of a hiatus from doing some of these presentations for a few months, but you know what? My favorite part of Fridays is that I get to present with you. So how are you feeling today, John?
Right back at you, Dave. I'm so excited to be here, and I will truthfully say that this is what I've been looking forward to all week, and this is the best part of my day. So I can't wait to get into this and have one of our great chats.
Fantastic. And you know, John, you and I were just talking about some really relevant content that's just hot off the press that we're going to be able to talk about here today. So this is going to be an exciting hour. A little bit of housekeeping for all of our wonderful attendees today. John and I love to keep our sessions as interactive as possible. So if you've got any burning questions that you'd like us to get to throughout the session, we like to take the questions live. And yeah, just fire away if something really resonates with you or you want us to dig in a little bit. We're happy to take and cover some of those questions. All right, John, let's go have some fun for the next hour. Hybrid cloud computing, it feels like we've been talking about this for 10 plus years. And, you know, we went through a period of time, John, where, you know, on-prem infrastructure was dead. Everybody's moving to the cloud. You know, you're crazy if you want to keep on-prem infrastructure. And I have to tell you something, you know, as we look in the rearview mirror here, John, and now 10 years has gone by with this, I would have to say that nothing is further from the truth. You know, I'm still seeing organizations having a heavy footprint of on-prem infrastructure that needs to be managed properly. Now, that being said, do I see organizations moving more workloads up to the cloud? I think it depends on the organization, but I do see a balance. And so I don't think it's an all or nothing type build. And this introduces some very interesting challenges for us as we look to secure that infrastructure, because if you had pure on-prem infrastructure, I think the model for securing that would be different than all cloud versus a hybrid approach. And so that's hopefully what we're going to have a chance to discuss a little bit here today. So John, what are kind of your thoughts on, you know, securing that hybrid infrastructure that we have now that doesn't seem to be going anywhere?
Well, so Dave, I kind of see it the same way. My experiences show that, that thing that we heard about years ago where it's like, oh, everybody's going to do a lift and shift from on-prem to the cloud. Yeah, that really hasn't happened, and I don't think it's going to happen. I pretty much see that there are a few very small organizations that might be completely cloud-based, but everyone I deal with now is hybrid. Now, hybrid can take the form of interconnected systems between on-prem and the cloud, or it could take the form of you have some systems on-prem, some systems in the cloud, but there is no interconnectivity to them. I see that in a lot of smaller to mid-size organizations. And what I mean by that is they'll have email in the cloud, and they've created an entire separate identity management system, so people have a different username and password than they do on their on-prem Active Directory that they use to log into their legacy business app or whatever. And, that does create those unique security challenges of having multiple attack vectors that you have to secure all of them. And, I've been a big proponent for years of reducing your identity management systems to a single point because the more username and password databases or identity management systems that you have, the more likely it is that you miss securing one, or one develops a vulnerability that the other doesn't have, or people, heaven forbid, use the same password in each of them to make it easier on them. All those things go up. So I really don't like that that's disconnected, but I do see people doing that, and they shouldn't. And if you have systems that are disconnected between the cloud and your on-prem, understand you have to secure them all. And Dave, I know I've heard you say this many times in the past, just because you put it in the cloud doesn't make it secure.
No, and what a great point. And just further to that point about on-prem and hybrid infrastructure, I'd like to just clarify one point. There are certain pieces of infrastructure that over the last 10 years I have seen almost completely disappear from on-prem. And one of those, John, is our email systems. So I don't really see a lot of organizations running on-prem Exchange servers anymore. Most have moved up due to a lot of benefits of having cloud-hosted email and those types of solutions. And so a lot of that's moved up to like Office 365. I do see people using and leveraging some SaaS-based SQL and database applications in the cloud. So I'm not saying that it's not there, but I think just the proliferation that was expected, that we would just be no more on-prem, you'll never buy a server again, all of our IT pros are going to be out of jobs. Well, I have to tell you something, I don't know of any of my friends that are IT pros that have lost their jobs due to cloud computing. So let's just level set right there. And so one of the big problems, John, with taking and, having hybrid cloud computing where we've got some type of connectivity back on-prem, we'll have like an express route to Azure or some type of VPN connectivity up to our tenants so that we can now share resources between our cloud tenants and our on-prem infrastructure. Is you raised such a valid point here, is that it's almost like you have the option when you build a server to just next, finish, and bingo, bango, you've got an operating system installed. Does that mean that it's secured? No, absolutely not. Does that mean that it's hardened by default? No, the vendors need to make the applications and operating systems usable. Now, that being said, in the cloud, John, Microsoft has actually started to offer free hardened images with the Center for Internet Security. And so basically they're pre-locked down so that you don't have this syndrome of next finish. It's all low-hanging fruit for the threat actors that are out there. And so, yeah, don't be that victim of next finish. And when we look at implementing zero trust security models, this not only has to be done on one side, like the cloud with, role-based access control and just-in-time access and privileged identity management, we also have to take that same approach on-prem, and we also have to take an approach of, okay, how are we going to manage these hybrid resources? And this is a little tricky because from my personal experience, John, I've actually found that implementing security for cloud-based systems is actually easier because the mechanisms and the moving parts are already installed there, whereas on-prem we might have a little bit more work to do. So what are your thoughts kind of on zero trust between on-prem and, cloud-based compute?
Well, I have said for the past couple of years that proper security is cultural. It's like saying integrity is cultural. It's not a thing that we just have to check a box on a list or do. Security permeates everything so much so now, and it's so critical to the proper operation of an organization and its successful continued operation that it has to be cultural. You've heard me use, expressions such as secure first and isolate, then investigate. Those things that I talk about a lot, and that's really because of this premise I have that security needs to be cultural. And if you have adapted security to be part of your culture, then you will, of course, have zero trust everywhere, whether it be on cloud or on-prem. It's not a checklist where you're trying to see, am I doing it properly here? Am I doing it properly here? It is, you will do it proper everywhere because it is who you are. So you will take advantage of those things like the security baselines and the CIS recommendations, both for your on-prem and your cloud-based resources. But, those are things you're doing because you won't accept not having a secure first implementation wherever you exist. And this even extends beyond the conventional things that we talk about on a hybrid environment, where we're talking about on-prem and on cloud to, your remote users, all those people that started working from home during COVID and may still be working there. You're extending that culture to how are they securing their networks and how are you securing the endpoints on those networks and all that sort of thing. It just becomes something you do by nature and by habit.
Yeah, and I think one of the other big pieces that, hybrid is really nice for our on-prem infrastructure is the agents that we use for, XDR, MDR, advanced threat protection, EDR solutions. Most of those have hooks to the cloud. There are cloud-based components inside of there that we use to take and make sure that we're protecting and locking down those environments. So you may not even realize it, but you're a lot more hybrid than what you think you are, even with those agents that are running inside of your infrastructure. All right, so next topic here, you had mentioned it a couple minutes ago, which was just the strength of an organization having a strong identity and access management practice and, eliminating the needs for, just massive amounts of separate password databases when logging into enterprise services. So this is the other probably biggest shift that I've seen from a hybrid compute perspective is that we 20 years ago, 25 years ago, everybody moved over to this great and wonderful thing called Active Directory from their Windows NT or Novell domains that they had, Novell NDS infrastructure that they had. And that identity management piece that we've had has kind of remained on-prem. And now what we do is we sync that up to the cloud with a mechanism like AD Connect or others. And then we try to establish single sign-on for these applications. And this not only extends out from our organization, but also out through the partner organizations. So I've seen that, as we've moved a lot of cloud-based services and applications into SaaS model, and maybe we're providing that as a service to customers, we can now leverage these, these identity management solutions to easily give them access to the components that they need while still maintaining the requirements for tight and rigid security controls. So I know that you work with a lot of organizations on their identity management pieces, John. Is this something that's really difficult for organizations to get going on if they haven't started yet, which is, really pushing forward for that single unified identity management platform?
It's not difficult to get started with. In fact, I think it's one of the easiest things for organizations to attack as an opportunity for improvement, because there are so many simple things that we can do that move us closer and closer to that target of, a single strong identity source that every organization can look and go, oh, I could do this, and it wouldn't take a lot of money, it wouldn't take a lot of time, it wouldn't take a lot of people, and that sort of thing. And, one of those is beginning to look at, for instance, role-based. Start looking at and saying, hey, I have this account over here. Why does it have domain admin rights? What is it doing? Well, this is one of my easiest examples to give. If it isn't being used to administer a domain controller, it doesn't need to be domain admins. You and I, our good friend Sammy Leo is always saying that, and I go further in what I just said and add on to that and say, not only am I talking about administering a domain controller, but I'm talking about administering a domain controller's domain controller related functions. So if you have DNS located on your domain controller, you don't need to be a domain admin to administer DNS, right, Dave? But how many times have you and I run into an account where they're domain admin levels and what they're really administering is DNS or DHCP or something like that?
Yeah, and I think it moves even beyond just role-based. I think we have to think about it as component-based administration. And so, the role-based administration is one thing where, we are the DNS administrator, but it's also the component that lives inside of that application or cloud-based SaaS provider that's up there, right? It's just like we don't need to give away the keys to the kingdom. It makes it harder on the developers. Don't get me wrong. I'm not the best friend of the development organizations because I push back on them. And I'm like, no, you don't need local administrator rights to install this app or to run this application. We need to really dig into what you actually need. Yeah, but it slows down the development process, John. The project's going to take twice as long. And so my argument to that is, great, the project takes twice as long. At least you didn't get ransomed through that unsecured application, because if you got ransomed, you're talking an end of days event, particularly for the organization. And so, I will push back. And, we don't, not necessarily all the best friends of the organizations when we push back and secure and harden things, are we, John?
No, but it's our job. It's our role to be honest and upfront and say what we think is best in the long-term health goal. And, that brings me to looking at the MFA, the multi-factor. When it comes to hybrid, if you want to have cyber insurance that pays out and pays out quickly when you need it to, anything you have located in the cloud needs to have MFA. That is almost a universal requirement. It doesn't matter if you say, oh, well, it's just my Adobe stock that people are accessing, using their account. Why do I have to MFA that or whatever? Well, the insurance company says that pretty much if it's cloud-based, they want you to MFA it. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that, particularly if you have that single federated identity access management where, for instance, that account that's being used to access your Adobe stock membership is your AD account. Well, by you not requiring MFA there, it creates a vector to kind of bypass MFA and get your credentials. So, yeah, if you want good insurance that's strong and pays out, better make sure your cloud stuff is MFA.
Yeah, and actually to that MFA point, Microsoft has actually been realizing that our end users and consumers of the MFA technology, the multi-factor authentication technology, are getting something called MFA fatigue. And what MFA fatigue is they get so annoyed by all the pop-ups and prompts on their phones that they will just universally say, yes, 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 yes. They won't even check to see where the login's coming from. And so now to prevent this, Microsoft has actually in the last month or two strengthened their Azure AD multi-factor authentication by requiring you to select the right key code that you're seeing inside of there to try to eliminate that. So in moving forward with this, yeah, we're seeing the annoyance of the users, but I'm like, we have to work around this. So, the technology is catching up in behind, and, we're going to continually see the evolution and strengthening of, trying to keep those credentials strong. All right. So the next one that we've got, John, is connectivity to the cloud, right? And so this one here is really big where, we've got to take and access from our on-prem network up to the cloud, or maybe we're going to move our key VPN solutions up to the cloud as well. So Dave's number one piece of advice when we're extending out client-based VPNs, please do not deploy VPNs that have explicit any rules to anything inside of your infrastructure. And the reason for that is that when you connect in from home, you don't necessarily need to be connecting into one of your, for example, manufacturing facilities that are in another country. Maybe you don't even need to get across that network. Maybe your job role and job function only requires you to access some key accounting or financial systems. So we holistically need to look at this when we deploy secure cloud connectivity to say, listen, we only want to give you access to what you require access to when you require access to it. And so the concept in the cloud for this is actually called just-in-time connectivity. So we'll open it up only while you need it and then shut it down while it's not needed. It closes a big, wide, gaping hole. And this is very important for us to really think about this, because if that endpoint becomes compromised and it has full access to your network, welcome to the ransomware heyday that the bad guys had during the COVID-19 world pandemic. Because, John, you and I both got the same phone calls as soon as we sent everybody home from work. Oh my gosh, we need to get everybody connected right now. Okay, well, we can extend the VPNs out, but it's not really secure. I don't care. Get everybody working from home right now. And I know that lots of you listening had to go through the exact same thing. Well, as it turns out, we were extending VPNs to people's home PCs because that's all that they had access to. And they were just supposed to RDP back into, their workstation at work or whatever it was. And guess what happened? We have no control. We have no advanced threat protection agents on their home PCs. And lo and behold, ransomware heyday, right? And so what we're looking at now, and I know, John, maybe you can speak to this one, organizations are kind of reining this in now from all the problems that we created and saying, listen, if you can't access, I want to analyze what you're doing. And even better yet, I'm going to give you a secured corporate connection, maybe a Starlink or something like that. Or I'm going to take and get you a secure device that, the IT organization can control. Because BYOD part of this, especially during COVID-19 for the past few years, created a horrific mess from a cybersecurity standpoint. So what are you seeing out in the field in regards to this? Am I off base with this, John?
You are definitely not off base, but there is so much I have to say about this. We all created a significant amount of technical debt as we raced to get people connected during COVID, right? We implemented things in such a way to just get them up and running, to your point, because we were told, just get them connected now, get them working now, get them working now. Well, the technical debt is that now we have to go back and rein those things in and fix those things, and it takes a lot more effort to do it now than it would have to just take a little extra time to do it right back then, but that's the debt we have to pay. However, I do want to say that it's uncanny to me, the similarity between what your exact point about VPNs with any rules and the RBAC topic we talked about earlier, right? It's really the same concept applied to two different functional areas, yet so many companies will argue, hey, I need any connectivity on the network. I need to be able to access everything on the network. That doesn't make any more sense than that developer saying, I need local admin rights to be able to run this Hello World app that, allows you to print a label. Okay, that doesn't make any sense. Why do you need to edit every part of my registry to be able to print a label? You don't. Why do you need to be able to access the video surveillance system in the cafeteria when your role is to enter HR times? You don't. And so the same reasons why companies should be implementing role-based access control for user accounts means, to me, they should be implementing role-based, or to your point, actually function-based connectivity for their VPNs and their connections. You should take the time and the exercise to identify what is it that this computer or this device needs to access when connected, and that's all they should get. One of the principles I tell people all the time when I talk to them about security is that the right thing gets access to the right system at the right time. Nothing more, nothing less. And that thing can be a person or a device, it doesn't matter. They get access to what's needed to accomplish their task for the time needed to accomplish it, nothing more, nothing less. And yes, that does mean that if somebody logs on once a day from 8 a.m. until 9 a.m. and does their job, I don't believe that they should have an always-on VPN that's connected 24 hours a day. You are opening yourself up to an attack 23 hours of the day that you didn't need to be open to. Why take the chance?
Awesome, John. Awesome. All right. So the next one is now we're going to have some data up in the cloud, right? So, we've bought in, we're starting to store some data up in the cloud. And there are some really distinct benefits of storing data up in the cloud. And one of the biggest ones is the cost. The cost per gigabyte or terabyte for storing data up in the cloud is much cheaper than you having to go buy that on-prem. And so also get the ability to geo-replicate that data where, you might not have that ability to do that with your on-prem solution. So there's a lot of benefits with that. However, that being said, once again, don't be the victim of next finish. Just because you can spin it up in 10 seconds doesn't mean that it's all secured and it's all hardened. Microsoft has actually realized that this is such a problem inside of their cloud-based computing environments up in Azure that their top-of-the-line security solution, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, actually provides a running checklist for everyone inside of their tenants as they spin up resources so that they can take and they can harden and lock down to best practices. So if you're not following through with that, then you're leaving yourself wide open. For example, just one point around cloud-based storage. I'm storing data that is going to be shipped from on-prem. Maybe I'm archiving some file server, some historical data. Blob storage is a great place for that. Or maybe I'm archiving backups up there or something like that. And I need to get some historical data up there. Okay, does that mean that you need an external IP address and access to that blob storage account remotely outside of your network? Well, if you're not careful in the configurations you just did, and it might be incredibly insecure. And so you need to go through those checklists. You need to make sure that you harden your tenants. There are actually prescriptive ways of doing that inside of your cloud tenant where you can use things like Azure Blueprints and you can lock things down to make sure that you are under full compliance and policy. And so you're not going to take and have issues. Because I'm going to tell you, John, right now, the bad guys have gotten really smart and they know that ransoming infrastructure takes effort on their side. Gaining access to a single system and exfiltrating, that is taking all your data off your network and storing it in the dark web, is way easier because now they don't have to like ransom the entire organization. Now I just get your data, and I'm just going to hold you hostage for your data because maybe you have proprietary information in there, whatever it is, patient records. Who knows? That data can't get out. And that's way more valuable than potentially just whole-level ransoming the entire environment. So from your perspective, locking this down, do you see value in encrypting, like using the inline encryption capabilities of cloud-based storage, or do you just leave it wide open and just chance it?
Dave, that's I cringe when I hear the word wide open in almost any context, because the fact that people still don't believe it could happen to them or make excuses for why they shouldn't invest in it. I feel bad because I'm like, none of that matters when you are the 1 out of 10 or the 1 out of 100 or the 1 out of a million. You won't care then. All you'll care about is the fact that, like you said, your data is captive or unavailable. You can't continue operations. You can't do these kind of things. And nowadays in the era of cyber warfare, to your point, they may not care whether they take your whole company out or just a piece of it or even a single workstation. They're just looking for damage. They just want to do damage. And if they can damage 1 or 100, oh, well, I still accomplished something. And it's automated. So you have to take every edge you can to protect yourself and to make yourself the smaller target on the field. I love that analogy about dodgeball because I played it a lot when I was a kid, and I was always the tall, lanky one that would get hit. And I learned early on that the best way not to get hit was when the game starts, try to make yourself the smaller target. Everybody throws at the bigger target. So I tell people that with security. Make yourself the smaller target and make yourself the harder target. Encrypt those data storage points that you have both in-house on your endpoints or in your cloud storage. Definitely take advantage of that encryption and that sort of thing. And, as far as DLP goes, your data is important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be investing in devices and storage and IT people to protect it and all that. So losing it is a big deal. Now, some data is worth more than other data, whatever, but it is important, and it's worth implementing DLP protection mechanisms. And you may have requirements too. A lot of organizations now are insisting that you have DLP processes in place. Insurance companies are insisting upon that. Governments are insisting upon that, right? There's provisions in certain laws, whether it be GPDR or anything like that, that require you to take certain actions to protect data. HIPAA requires organizations to take certain actions to protect patient data, confidentiality, all those things. Data loss is a big deal across the board, so make it harder for you to lose your data. That's my best advice I can give you, and that means take advantage of anything and everything that's offered to you, such as encryption. I'm a big fan of BitLocker on my endpoints.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. We've got to do everything we can, protect the network at all costs, right, John? And so we actually have a question that came in here from James. And so the question is, what are the most common challenges organizations face when implementing a hybrid cloud cloud management and security solutions, and how can these challenges be overcome? And so I can answer this question for you, James. And I feel that, one of the biggest challenges of implementing those cloud management security solutions is it's very, very easy to deploy the agents and get data reporting into the system. What is not easy is to operationalize your staff and or team on what to do with the plethora of data that's going to be coming inbound. What does this alert mean? What should I do? When should I notify people? This is huge, right? Because what will end up happening in the same way that we have MFA fatigue, us as IT pros, we get email and alert fatigue as well. So now all of a sudden that critical alert that just came in and said possible ransomware activity really means that that's an all hands on deck. You need to act right now because you have a matter of minutes to react to that before something really tragic happens to your organization. So for me, the biggest part about that is the people side of the configuration, because without proper training, that's never going to work, right? We've got lots of tools out there that can help us, but that's a big one. All right, so next one, John. Modern security and defense. Well, look at this. James, this is fantastic. You just led right into our next section for us. Thank you very much. Security monitoring and threat detection. John, you and I have been implementing this for organizations now for a while, and this has actually become a very, very big part of our job roles and responsibilities. For you particularly, because you've acted in the role of CISO for a couple organizations, and so this is pretty huge. How hard is it, John, to operationalize a cybersecurity team? And do you get pushback when you go back to the business and say, hey guys, listen, we need to take and staff up on this?
It's a pain, and yes. Those are the short answers. Now let me elaborate a little bit. It's difficult. It takes effort to operationalize security, to turn security into that culture that I spoke about earlier, right? To devote resources who aren't just pointed at security, but are dedicated to it and that sort of thing. It's a lot of effort. And I see organizations fail for many reasons. Things like, well, we're just going to take somebody whose role is help desk and we'll point them at looking at security a couple hours a week and that'll be good enough. Or, security really isn't a thing for us. We'll deal with it when we have to deal with it. Or, hey, we've got this person that has spent their entire career in database administration, but now I want them to be my cybersecurity administrator. I'm not saying they can't become a cybersecurity administrator. I'm just saying that there's some time required to develop those skills, and that testing isn't something you grab overnight. And many organizations can't delegate. They have to cross-pollinate, if you will. So the person that is the systems administrator becomes the security administrator and that sort of thing. And they have to now add to their continuing education and their training, right? And they can't just go to the conference that covers the system admin part. They gotta focus on the security part, and that's a juggling act for them and for their manager to try and make sure that they have the time and the money and that sort of thing. And then getting organizations to make the investments necessary to train up on that is another challenge, right? Budgets are always tough. Although I will say that from just the last 4 years, 2019, 2020, 21, 22, I have certainly seen a broader understanding at the executive level and the board level of organizations to the importance of cybersecurity and cyber insurance. So they are willing to invest in it. But then I also have seen some IT departments take advantage of that and basically just suck money in, but not target it towards concerted development of security tactics and strategies and that sort of thing. So there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of moving parts, and that's why I said it's a pain. And yes.
Yeah, well, and along those lines, John, the IT department that seem like they've just now been able to go back to trade shows and security trade shows, that for that matter, and they find all these new greatest products that are going to help protect them against everything. And then us as IT pros now realize that we have 7 different competing security agents running on the exact same server. And then the business comes back to us, or the customers come back saying, wow, this is really slow. And we come back saying, well, we've given you pretty much the fastest hyper-converged infrastructure known to man, so there's no way that that should be slow. And so that's actually been some of my recent discussions, is almost too much on the protection side. I know that that seems contrary to what we're talking about, but there has to be a fine balance inside of there, right? And so, yeah, it's interesting for sure. All right, the next one here. I actually had a question that I had a friend of mine ask me, and they were hoping that we would be able to chat on the webinar about this, John. And it was in regards to vendor decisions that you're going to be making, because traditionally over the last 25 years, I feel that, Microsoft hasn't really been known as an industry leader for security. And I think that was probably a pretty fair statement by this individual. And he said now, with Microsoft, moving up into, the Gartner Magic Quadrant, it seems like, you're kind of getting into that whole nobody gets fired for buying IBM back when we used to work in compute a long time ago to, nobody gets fired for putting in Microsoft security solutions. Are you seeing Microsoft security solutions being accepted more holistically and kind of as a norm for organizations now?
Absolutely, Dave, and I recommend them as one of the best. And one of the reasons that I do that is because I look at an organization, and particularly public organizations, and I go out and I look at crazy data. And of course, you often make fun of me for this, and rightfully so. You know how many hours and upon hours I spend reading the fine print of cyber insurance policies and those kind of things, and that sort of data. Well, I do the same kind of thing in this instance, and I look at a particular metric. How much does a company spend on security as a portion of their whole revenue, right? So if a company makes $100 million a year and invests $1 million in their security initiatives, that's, a pretty small amount. And if you look at the amount, the sheer dollars that Microsoft is throwing at security, whether it be their security products or their culture, or just the training of their different product teams and groups, they are double digits ahead of the investment that they were making 10 years ago. There's just no comparison, and you can see that prove out in the performance of those things. When you look at products such as, their Defender Advanced Threat Protection products, you and I are a big fan of those, or the Azure Privileged Identity Management. All these products, they perform really well. And my Windows endpoints, it used to be a joke about the built-in threat protection that was in them, and now I feel that is the best solution that folks can go with, rather than installing additional third-party products that just slow the system down and that sort of thing. So yeah, not only do I feel Microsoft has made huge gains in this space, I feel that they're proving themselves out to be one of the best, and I have no problem talking as an advocate. And I may sound like a fanboy, but I'm basing it on data and real-world experience.
Oh, absolutely. Great points, John. Absolutely. And so, in the previous slide, we were talking a little bit about the deficiencies that we have with our operational teams not being able to scale or ramp up fast enough. So I do believe there is some value in automating the remediation capabilities of these tools that we have. So, like, for example, when we deploy Defender Endpoint Advanced Threat Protection agents out on our systems, I always configure it inside of a full remediation mode. So if something is detected, I want the automatic quarantining. I want the automatic, isolation capabilities. I want that stuff to be done. And so it's almost, through our process that, we've developed, John, which is, I call it the INR, and which is isolate first, regardless of who it is, then notify the individual because they're going to be wondering why they have no access, and then work on the remediation. And that could be from the CEO level all the way down. And the more that we can take and automate some of those pieces, and now with, the new wave of AI capabilities included in some of these solutions, is huge. We actually have a question that came in. I'll let you take this one. I'll read it off for you here, John. And it's a question from Bob. And it's in regards to password managers. And so he's talking a little bit about application procedures and acumen. Which password managers are good? And, he looks at it and says, which ones do the experts trust or use? And that's a good question to ask. Second question is that, what process do you use or develop to use the password manager? And how about the acumen around that? And the last part about this, and I know you'll love this, John, is I'm scared to trust Android apps that are available from different developers. So, John, what do you think?
You know the can of worms you just opened there completely. So I'll deal with the first part, password managers. And this is a good heated discussion that I have with lots of IT pros. And I have it with not IT pros also, just end users. And it often goes like this. Well, that LastPass application, they had a public breach and they've done this wrong and that wrong. And I'm like, absolutely. And, this small one that nobody's ever heard of before, they haven't had that problem. And I'm like, absolutely. And we used to see this years ago, right? When we talked about Windows OS versus Mac OS and things like that. When you're a bigger target on the dodgeball court, you tend to have more balls thrown at you. And often they hit you. When you're smaller, you don't have as many, but it doesn't mean you aren't as vulnerable. And I would rather go with the big guy that can fend them off, that can defend it and deflect it without actually getting eliminated from the game, than some of the smaller ones that haven't proven that they've got that robust structure in place. So, for instance, talking about the publicly disclosed, LastPass cyber incident, that sort of thing, I'm still a big fan of theirs. They're part of LogMeIn, and I use other technologies there, and I feel that they can remediate that. But there are other good ones out there. I mean, you could use Dashlane, you could use 1Password, Keeper. There's a number of them out there that you can use. Now we get to that procedures and acumen part of it, where we talk about just because you go, hey, I implemented the best one, that doesn't mean you can be more lax. You should teach your users and insist that your users follow procedures based on if they have the weakest password manager out there. All that does is strengthen their activity and their behavior and strengthen your protection. So, yeah, I do make them change the master password to their vault as frequently as they used to change all the other passwords. But at least now, instead of having to change 45 of them or 450 of them, they have one. I do make them do things like implement MFA on those devices, and it's MFA that I consider good MFA, not SMS type MFA, and a number of those different things. And I feel you should be doing those same things. Take advantage of password managers. It's one of the only ways, or password vaults, I should say. It's one of the only ways I've found to really get end users to start behaving properly when it comes to password management, credential management. But still, don't let them get lax. Don't let them get lazy. Now, when it comes to Android, I will say this. I and many organizations have straight out banned Android. And it isn't because I have a emotional a war going on with Google or Android or anything else. In fact, I think some of their areas are great and awesome in that. It's because I'm making a business decision. And when I look at the business and I say, what does the business need from a mobile device? Well, it needs to be able to make phone calls. It needs to be able to get text messages. It needs to be able to support encryption. needs to be able to get email, and I do all that. And I say, okay, well, I can do that with Android devices from 100 different manufacturers with 1,000 different variations of operating system, or I can do that with iPhones, which come from one manufacturer and may have different versions of OS, but I can control that. So I simply simplify it so that my IT team has less to support, and I as an organization have to invest less in it. And then I also have other things like the NDAA I consider. Guess what? The National Defense Authorization Act, which is passed every year and dictates a number of things about people who do business with the government, with the Department of Defense, that sort of thing. It bans products from a particular company that is involved in a lot of Android devices, Hawaii. And I'm not making any judgment on them or not. What I am doing is saying that if you're a contractor to the government, if you're a subcontractor to the government, even if you're not making something that ends up being sold to the government, you still are expected to comply with this, and you can't have those devices on your network. And if you allow them, now you and IT have to manage them. So sometimes it is just easier to take the path of making a decision that eliminates you needing to deal with that. So I know that was really long-winded, and I apologize, but it was a can of worms. So now, Dave, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, we're going to take one more question here. This one's from Anil. And the question is surrounding backup storage that comes with the licenses by default. So I think in chatting about this, I work with a lot of backup vendors that are out there. And this one here for me is the backup storage in the cloud is just another backup target, Anil. So the applications that you're using to support those backups and maybe do direct object-based backups to the cloud, they're charging you as part of their application, but typically not for the ability to use that as a target, right? So that target is kind of typically included in most of those platforms. And you would only have to normally pay for the usage. So you'd only have to pay for the number of gigs or terabytes that you would consume up in the cloud. And with that, John, thank you very much. It's been a blast. I always love doing these sessions with you. And let's go ahead and hand that back over to Mr. Rammel, the man, the myth, the legend. And now we can go enjoy the rest of our Friday.
All right. Great job, guys. Thanks for an excellent presentation and answering all those questions.